ABC General Hospital spoilers reveal that rumors of Sam's return to Port Charles began as a faint whisper drifting through online forums and fan circles, but soon the whisper thickened into something heavier, something electric, something that carried the weight of a storyline poised to rupture the emotional stability of an entire canvas. The news broke precisely at the moment when Port Charles was bracing for the grim inevitability surrounding Jason, a looming tragedy no one wanted to accept, but everyone felt tightening around them like a noose. The narrative machinery behind the scenes had been forced into overdrive. Scripts rewritten, plotlines rerouted, long-term arcs shattered and urgently reconstructed into something darker, more volatile, and shockingly uncertain. In the midst of this growing storm, Sam's return did not appear as a gentle homecoming, but as a seismic shift that promised both salvation and devastation at once. A haunting echo of everything the show had lost, and everything it still feared losing. For years, Sam and Jason had been the beating heart of countless storylines, sometimes united, sometimes broken, sometimes orbiting each other with unspoken longing, but their connection had always carried a gravitational weight that shaped entire seasons. Now, with Jason's apparent death approaching like an unstoppable shadow, the return of Sam created a strange paradox. Her presence was both a balm and a blade. On one hand, her reappearance offered the audience something familiar, a tether to a history filled with triumphs and losses they had all lived through with her. On the other hand, it underscored the brutality of what was coming, because nothing emphasized the emptiness of absence more sharply than the sudden reemergence of someone who had once filled that void. As Sam moved closer to Port Charles, physically, narratively, emotionally, the storylines around her began to twist. Characters reacted in ways that betrayed unease, alliances shifted, motivations blurred, old wounds tore open. Writers had no choice but to adjust everything, because Sam, returning at the exact moment Jason vanished, reshaped the entire emotional balance of the show. What was initially meant to be a transitional arc for other characters suddenly transformed into a reckoning, a recalibration, a violent narrative correction, in which Sam's return became the anchor the audience needed. But the characters themselves were wholly unprepared for. The tension rose not only from the storyline itself, but from the metadrama, the real-world anticipation of how her comeback would be positioned against Jason's exit. It was as if the show was torn between honoring legacy and embracing chaos, and in that war, Sam became the embodiment of both. Every detail surrounding Jason's impending fate contributed to the frenzy. The rumors of a dangerous mission gone wrong, the hints of a collapsing storyline leading to his demise, the emotional foreshadowing woven into recent episodes, all of it painted a portrait of tragedy long before it unfolded. And yet, the possibility of Sam returning added a dimension that no one expected. Hope twisted into grief, comfort poisoned by timing, nostalgia reshaped into something almost unbearable. Viewers imagined what it would mean for her to walk back into town only to discover that the one person whose presence defined her story for over a decade was slipping away forever. The cruelty of it amplified everything, making her return feel less like a revival and more like a cruel echo of a chapter that could never be restored. The closer she came, the more erratic the narrative energy grew. Characters who had settled into new dynamics suddenly felt unanchored, as if Sam's shadow exposed fractures none of them had addressed. Her name alone stirred conflicts. Guilt resurfaced in those who had failed Jason. Panic rose in those who knew secrets tied to his disappearance. And quiet dread settled among those who understood that her homecoming signaled a turning point from which no storyline could revert. The world of Port Charles, already brittle from uncertainty, seemed to tremble underneath the weight of an impending emotional collision. What made her return even more volatile was the sense that it served as a last gift to fans, a symbolic offering to soften the blow of Jason's withdrawal. It was as though the show was preparing to take something monumental away, and Sam's presence was meant to fill the void, even if imperfectly. But this kind of emotional substitution comes with consequences. Fans knew it, the writers knew it, and the narrative itself seemed aware of its own manipulation. Her reappearance risked deepening the heartbreak rather than soothing it, because it reminded everyone of what the show once was and what it was about to lose forever. Yet within that chaos, something powerful began to crystallize. Sam's return, whether intended or accidental, became the emotional axis around which the new era of General Hospital would pivot. She represented unfinished business, unresolved grief, and the haunting legacy of a partnership that defined a generation. Her presence promised answers, turmoil, redemption, or destruction, but above all, she promised movement. And in a storyline suffocating under the weight of Jason's looming death, movement was the only thing that could keep the narrative alive. As she drew nearer, the sense of inevitability sharpened. The city braced for the moment her footsteps hit the pavement, for the moment her eyes scanned the streets that once held so much of her history. But waiting for her was not reunion, it was a vacuum, where Jason once stood, a void shaped like a man she had loved, fought beside, mourned, rediscovered, and lost in more ways than one. The tragedy of her return was not that she would be too late to save him, but that she would be perfectly on time to witness the world he left behind collapse under the weight of his absence. In the end, Sam's return was not simply a plot twist, it was an emotional detonator. It ignited fear, excitement, grief, and anticipation all at once, transforming the storyline into a volatile mixture of past and present. As the city prepared for Jason's fall, Sam became the symbol of everything the show could still reclaim, and everything it was powerless to change. Her arrival would not erase the coming heartbreak, but it would give shape to it, giving viewers something to hold on to in the wreckage. And perhaps that was the point all along. That sometimes the only way to endure a loss as great as Jason's is to bring back the one person whose presence makes the loss impossible to ignore and impossible to forget. The revelation struck Port Charles like a violent rupture in the center of its narrative universe. The writers confirmed that Sam was the one who killed Jason. It was a truth so staggering, so violently incompatible with everything audiences believed about her, that it tore through the fandom and the fictional world with equal force. What had once been a quiet theory whispered at the edges of speculation suddenly hardened into canon, reshaping the emotional architecture of the show in ways no one could have predicted. But the truth did not stand alone. It came tethered to a darker confession, one that rewired the very meaning of guilt, agency, and betrayal. Sam had not acted of her own will. She had been controlled. The idea of Sam as a murderer would have been devastating enough, but the revelation that her actions were the result of a shadowy manipulator lurking just beyond the reach of the storyline transformed the tragedy into something monstrous. It meant the killing was not a moment of impulse or vengeance, but a carefully orchestrated collapse engineered by someone who understood exactly how to dismantle the emotional pillars of Port Charles. It meant Jason's death was not only a loss, it was a warning. And the person delivering that warning had chosen Sam as the perfect weapon, turning her into a vessel of destruction while stripping her of every shred of agency she once had. Once the truth surfaced, the narrative around her spiraled into a new kind of chaos. Sam was no longer simply the returning hero meant to anchor the storyline after Jason's departure. She was now the epicenter of a psychological disaster that threatened to reshape the entire series. Her memories fractured, her identity destabilized, her sense of self weaponized against the one person she had loved with a fierce, lifelong loyalty. The writers had not merely rewritten her story, they had detonated it, scattering the shards across every character connected to her, and in the aftermath, no one could escape the fallout. The new arc unfolded like a nightmare stitched into daylight. Every detail hinted at a deeper conspiracy, one driven by a puppet master whose motivations remained obscured behind layers of manipulation. The notion that Sam had been controlled added a chilling dimension to her tragedy because it meant she had been conscious enough to witness her own undoing, trapped in a body acting against her will, forced to commit the ultimate betrayal while powerless to stop it. The psychological devastation of such a violation elevated the storyline from mere shock value into something far more haunting, the destruction of identity itself. As the truth took hold, the city began to fracture under the weight of its implications. Characters who had once anchored themselves to Sam's strength now found themselves disoriented, unsure whether to fear her, mourn her, or defend her. The loss of trust rippled outward, destabilizing long-standing alliances and cracking open dormant rivalries. Yet, the darkest consequence was not the collapse of relationships, but the rise of obsession. Every character, every faction, every viewer became consumed by the same burning question: who was controlling her and why? The writers leaned into the uncertainty with a vicious precision. Every new clue hinted at a deeper level of orchestration, as though the unseen villain had anticipated each emotional reaction and built the storyline to exploit it. Jason's death was no longer a single event, but the first domino in a chain of devastation designed to unwind Port Charles from within. Sam's torment, her fragmented flashbacks, the sense of an invisible presence manipulating her mind, all of it fueled a rising hysteria that transformed the narrative into a living nightmare. The emotional horror grew not from the revelation that Sam had killed Jason, but from the realization that she had been turned into the perfect symbol of helplessness, her trauma engineered for maximum destruction. The manipulator had chosen her not only because she mattered to Jason, but because she mattered to the audience. She was the one loss the show was never meant to endure. the one fracture deep enough to tear the foundation apart. And now, with her story twisted into an unrecognizable shape, the terror of what might come next began to overshadow every plotline. What emerged was not merely a tragedy, but a full-scale narrative catastrophe. The show had crossed into a territory where grief, confusion, and obsession blended into a single pulsing force that drove every character forward. Jason's absence became a haunting presence, a reminder of what Sam had lost, what she had been forced to become, and what Port Charles might never recover from. The writers had unleashed something raw and irreversible into the heart of the storyline, a psychological war in which Sam was both the victim and the weapon. And as the world braced for the next twist, one truth became impossible to ignore. This was only the beginning of the nightmare. Danny had always believed that nothing in Port Charles could surprise him anymore, but the truth about Jason's death, and the horrifying revelation that Sam had been manipulated into killing him, shattered whatever stability he had left. The news hit him like a violent rupture in the center of his chest, tearing open memories he had spent years trying to make sense of. He had lost Jason once, mourned him once, carried the weight of that absence through the fragile years of growing up without a father. But now, to face another funeral, another grave, another unbearable goodbye, was a cruelty no child should have to endure twice. The shock hollowed him out. It left him drifting in a haze where nothing felt real anymore, where every breath felt stolen, where every attempt to understand the truth only tightened the knot inside his chest. The world around him kept moving, reshaping itself in response to the scandal, the rumors, the darkness swallowing every corner of Port Charles. But Danny felt suspended in a space between grief and disbelief. The writer's shocking twist had not only rewritten Sam's fate, it had rewritten his. And now he was being pushed into a role he had never imagined, organizing Jason's funeral, not as a child who had adored his father, but as the only one still standing who could honor him. The responsibility pressed on him like a weight far too heavy for his young shoulders. It wasn't supposed to be him. It was supposed to be Sam. It was supposed to be the people who had known Jason in ways he never had the time to experience. But Sam was lost in her own torment, shattered by the truth of what she had been forced to do. Others were paralyzed by shock, fear, guilt, or the chaos rising from the shadows of Port Charles. And so, in the void left behind, Danny stepped forward, because grief demanded a shape, and someone had to give it form. Planning the funeral became its own kind of storm. Every detail forced him to confront the reality he was desperate to reject. Choosing the location became an admission that Jason was truly gone. Selecting the flowers felt like closing a door he had fought for years to keep open. Signing the papers made the loss tangible in a way no headline or rumor ever could. Each decision etched sorrow deeper into his bones, transforming the funeral into a monument not just for Jason's death, but for the childhood Danny could no longer reclaim. But as preparations continued, something far darker began to loom over the process. The tragedy surrounding Sam, the unknown puppeteer manipulating her actions, and the swirling hysteria gripping Port Charles ignited a new wave of danger that seeped into every layer of the story. Danny sensed it, a quiet dread threading itself through every moment. Jason's death was not the end, it was the beginning of a new catastrophe. The funeral itself felt less like a farewell and more like an invitation for the shadows to rise again. The city was on edge. Secrets were tightening. The manipulator's presence pulsed beneath the surface, unseen but unmistakably there. Danny's grief evolved into something sharper. Not anger, not yet, but a clarity that danger was far from over. Jason's life had been filled with enemies, betrayals, and battles fought in the dark. His death, especially a death engineered through Sam, was too precise, too calculated to be anything but the first strike in a much larger war. Danny began to understand that by taking responsibility for the funeral, he was stepping into the heart of that storm. He was becoming the keeper of Jason's legacy, and with that legacy came risk. As the day approached, the weight of loss and uncertainty pressed tighter, bending the world around him into something almost unbearable. The funeral would bring answers, or destruction, or both. And Danny could not escape the bitter truth forming at the edges of his thoughts. Honoring Jason would not stop the disaster. It would merely illuminate how far the darkness was willing to reach. This was not just grief anymore. It was the opening move of a new tragedy, one that was already spiraling far beyond anyone's control.